There's a particular kind of frustration that comes from watching someone else succeed at a scale that seems impossible to explain. You look at the entrepreneur who built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, or the investor who identified an opportunity before everyone else, or the creator whose work found an audience of millions, and you tell yourself a story about them. The story usually involves luck. It involves being in the right place at the right time, knowing the right people, having access to capital you never had, or simply being born into circumstances that gave them an unfair head start. This story is comforting because it removes responsibility. If their success was luck, then your lack of equivalent success is also luck, a different kind, the unlucky variety, and there is nothing structurally you could have done differently. The randomness of the universe in this framing is both the explanation and the excuse. But this story deserves serious examination because I think it is mostly wrong. Not entirely wrong. Luck exists, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, but mostly wrong in a way that has consequences for how you think about your own economic life. If you accept the luck narrative as the primary explanation for wealth creation, you will organize your efforts accordingly. You will wait, you will hope, you will buy lottery tickets in various forms, literal and metaphorical. You will not do the patient structural work of building the kinds of assets, skills, and positions that generate wealth in a durable, repeatable way. The luck narrative is not just intellectually incomplete, it is practically harmful. What I want to explore here is a different framework, one that takes wealth creation seriously as an intellectual and structural problem rather than a matter of fortune. The framework I'm drawing on comes largely from the thinking of Naval Ravikant, a philosopher and investor who has spent considerable time developing a coherent theory of how individuals in modern economies can generate real, lasting wealth. His ideas are not motivational in the conventional sense. They do not promise shortcuts or secrets. They describe a set of principles that, when internalized and applied consistently over long periods of time, dramatically increase the probability that a person will build genuine economic independence. The emphasis is on probability, not certainty, on structure, not magic, on patient understanding, not desperate searching. Before we can understand how wealth is built, we need to be precise about what wealth actually is. This precision matters more than it might initially seem, because the word wealth is used in everyday conversation to mean several different things that are actually quite distinct from each other, and confusing them leads to confusion about how to pursue any of them. The first thing people often mean when they say wealth is money. Money is a medium of exchange and a store of value. It is a social technology, a shared agreement that certain tokens or numbers in a ledger represent claims on goods and services. Money is useful, obviously, but it is a flow, not a stock. Income is money arriving at a certain rate. If you stop working, the income stops. The money you have accumulated can be spent, but once it is gone unless you earn more. This is the reality most people live in. They trade time for money, and as long as the trade continues, they have money. When it stops, they do not. The second thing people mean by wealth is status. Status is your position in a social hierarchy. It is relative by definition. You can only have high status if others have lower status. Status is visible in the cars people drive, the neighborhoods they live in, the titles they hold, the events they attend. Status is ancient. Our brains are wired to pursue it because for most of human evolutionary history, high social status correlated with survival and reproduction. But status is a zero-sum game. When someone rises in status, others fall, at least in relative terms. The pursuit of status for its own sake is therefore exhausting and ultimately unfulfilling because the goal line keeps moving. Every acquisition of status reveals the next level above it. Wealth, in the specific sense that the framework we are exploring uses the word, is something different from both money and status. Wealth is assets that generate income without requiring your continued presence. It is ownership of things that produce value over time: companies, intellectual property, code, media, financial instruments, real estate in certain forms. The crucial distinction is that wealth works while you sleep. It does not depend on your labor on any given Tuesday. It is not a flow that requires constant replenishment. It is a stock that, if structured correctly, grows or at minimum sustains itself. The goal of building wealth in this sense is to achieve a state where your economic output is no longer constrained by the number of hours you are willing or able to work. This is sometimes called financial independence, but that phrase has become so overused that it has lost its precision. What we are really talking about is the decoupling of income from labor, the point at which you own things that produce value for others, and those others pay you for that value, regardless of what you are doing personally at any given moment. This distinction has profound practical implications. If you are optimizing for income, for the flow of money, you are likely optimizing for your hourly rate, your salary, your billing capacity. These are real improvements, and there's nothing wrong with them as far as they go. A higher salary is strictly better than a lower one, all else equal. But income optimization keeps you on the treadmill. It keeps you trading time for money, just at a better exchange rate. Wealth optimization is different. It asks, how do I build something that continues to produce value after I have stepped back from it? How do I create ownership positions and assets that serve human needs in ways that do not require my daily involvement? These are structurally different questions from how do I earn more per hour, and they lead to structurally different strategies. The moral dimension of wealth creation matters here, and it is worth dwelling on it for a moment before we proceed to the mechanics. There is a widespread intuition, especially in certain intellectual circles, that the accumulation of private wealth is inherently suspicious or even immoral. This intuition has some legitimate roots. There are clearly historical and contemporary examples of wealth accumulation through exploitation, rent seeking, regulatory capture, and various forms of extraction. These deserve criticism, but the framework we are exploring makes a careful distinction that I think is both intellectually honest and practically important. Wealth created through genuine value creation, through building something that people voluntarily choose to pay for because it makes their lives better in some way, is not a taking from others. It is an addition to the total pool of human welfare. When a software engineer writes code that helps 10 million people manage their time more effectively and is compensated for that, nobody has been made worse off by the transaction. In fact, everyone involved has been made better off. The users get something they value more than the money they pay, and the creator gets money they value more than the time they spent. This is the logic of voluntary exchange. Surplus is created, not redistributed. Wealth built this way is not a moral problem. It is, in fact, one of the more elegant mechanisms humanity has developed for incentivizing the creation of things that are genuinely useful. The framework we are examining is explicitly oriented toward this kind of wealth creation. It is not a guide to gaming systems, capturing rents, or exploiting informational asymmetries in extractive ways. It is a guide to building things of real value and to understanding how the economics of genuine value creation actually work in modern market economies. With that foundation established, we can begin to examine the structural elements that make wealth creation possible. The first and perhaps most important concept to understand is leverage. This word is used in finance to mean something specific, the use of borrowed capital to amplify returns, but in the broader sense the framework uses it, leverage refers to any mechanism that multiplies the output of your effort. Leverage is the difference between an individual craftsman who can produce 10 items a day with their own hands and a business owner who has organized a production system that produces 10,000 items a day with their design and management. The craftsman's output is linearly constrained by their time. The business owner's output is not. There are several distinct types of leverage available in the modern economy, and understanding them is essential to understanding how wealth is actually built. The oldest form of leverage is labor. If you can convince other people to work toward your goals in exchange for compensation, you effectively multiply your productive capacity by the number of people working with you. This has been the basis of business for centuries. Entrepreneurs hire employees, managers direct teams, and the output of the organization exceeds what any individual could produce alone. Labor leverage is real and important, but it has significant costs. Managing people is difficult and time-consuming. Employees require constant attention, motivation, and coordination. Misalignment between what the organization needs and what individual employees want is a constant source of friction. Labor leverage is also expensive in the obvious sense. You have to pay wages, and labor leverage does not scale infinitely or costlessly. The second form of leverage is capital. If you have money or can access other people's money, you can make investments that generate returns without requiring your personal labor. Capital is extraordinarily powerful as leverage because it is relatively frictionless. A dollar invested in a productive enterprise generates returns without requiring the investor to show up and work. This is why investors can become extremely wealthy without being directly involved in production. Capital finds the most productive uses and gets rewarded accordingly. The challenge with capital leverage, of course, is that you need capital to begin with, or you need to be trusted with other people's capital, which requires either a track record or extraordinary persuasion. Capital leverage is not equally available to everyone at the start. The third and fourth forms of leverage are newer and in certain respects more democratically accessible than either labor or capital. These are the leverage of code and the leverage of media, sometimes described together as permissionless leverage. Because unlike labor leverage, which requires convincing people to work for you, and capital leverage, which requires convincing people to invest with you, code and media can be deployed without asking anyone's permission. Code is, at its core, a set of instructions that a machine will execute without complaint, without rest, and without compensation beyond the cost of running the machine. A piece of software, once written, can be used by one person or 100 million people at essentially the same marginal cost. The economics of this are stunning when you think about them carefully. A programmer who writes useful software has effectively created a machine, a logical machine, running on physical hardware that does work on behalf of everyone who uses it. The programmer's time investment is front-loaded. The software continues to operate long after the programmer has moved on. This is not merely a metaphor for wealth building, it literally is wealth building. Software companies that achieve scale are among the most valuable in human history precisely because the leverage of code allows a small team to serve an enormous number of people with minimal marginal cost. Media leverage works on similar principles but through different mechanisms. Content written, audio, video can be created once and consumed many times. An essay read by 100,000 people required only the time to write it once. A podcast episode listened to by 1 million people was recorded once. A video watched by 50 million people was filmed in a finite amount of time. The creator's effort is expended at the point of creation, but the value of that effort can compound over time as the content finds new audiences. This is not new. Books have worked this way for centuries, but digital distribution has dramatically reduced the friction of reaching audiences, which means that the leverage available to creators of valuable content is historically unprecedented. The reason permissionless leverage is particularly important to understand is that it changes who can build wealth. Throughout most of human history, significant wealth required either inherited capital, access to land, control of labor, or proximity to political power. These are gate-kept resources. A person without capital, land, employees, or political connections could not easily build a business of significant scale. But code and media require primarily intelligence, taste, and patience. They require the ability to build something genuinely useful or genuinely interesting, and the discipline to do so consistently over time. These are not perfectly democratic qualities. Some people have more of them than others, and some environments cultivate them more effectively than others, but they are far more widely distributed than inherited capital or political access. This is a genuine structural shift in who can build wealth, and understanding it is central to understanding why the framework we are examining is relevant to a broader range of people than wealth building advice historically has been. But leverage by itself is not sufficient. Leverage amplifies effort, but if the underlying effort is generic, if what you are doing is something that anyone could do with similar training and time, then the economic value of your work will be competed away. Markets are extraordinarily efficient at identifying tasks that can be done by many people and reducing the compensation for those tasks to near the cost of training people to do them. This is not a complaint about markets. It is simply how they work. If you want compensation that significantly exceeds the cost of producing your output, you need to bring something to the market that cannot easily be replicated. This is where the concept of specific knowledge becomes essential. Specific knowledge in the framework we are examining is not the same as credentials or professional expertise in the conventional sense. A medical degree represents significant expertise, but it is expertise that is formally defined, taught through established curricula, credentialed through established institutions, and held by a large number of people who have followed the same path. This does not mean doctors are not valuable. They're enormously valuable. And the expertise is real, but the economic returns to medical expertise are constrained by the supply of people who have followed the same path. What Naval's framework describes as specific knowledge is something different. It is the knowledge, capability, or perspective that emerges from the particular combination of your own experience, curiosity, and temperament knowledge that cannot easily be taught through formal instruction, precisely because it is the product of a unique trajectory. Think about how specific knowledge actually develops. It is not the product of deliberate optimization toward a predetermined goal. It is more often the product of genuine curiosity, following its own logic across what might appear from the outside to be an incoherent set of interests. The person who spends years learning about a technical field out of pure interest and then happens to spend years in a particular industry and then develops strong opinions about both the technical possibilities and the business realities has assembled a specific combination of knowledge that very few other people in the world possess. This combination may not have been planned. It may look like a wandering path rather than a disciplined progression. But it produces a unique perspective that becomes genuinely valuable when the world encounters a problem that sits exactly at the intersection of those areas. This is a difficult idea to act on directly, which is one reason it is counterintuitive. Most career advice is implicitly directed at teaching you to be more like the most successful people in a given field, to acquire the same skills, credentials, and experiences that have historically led to success. But this advice, if followed literally, produces people who are the 100th or 1,000th person with a particular set of credentials rather than the only person with a particular combination of capabilities. The framework suggests a different approach, not optimization for a known target, but cultivation of genuine curiosity and the willingness to develop depth in areas that feel authentically interesting, even when their commercial application is not yet clear. The commercial application often emerges later, and when it does, the person who developed the knowledge out of genuine interest has a depth and authenticity that cannot easily be replicated by those who try to acquire the same knowledge instrumentally. This has a practical implication that is worth dwelling on. The question to ask is not what skills are currently most valued by the market, but rather, what do I find myself genuinely drawn to, unable to stop thinking about, or able to pursue with discipline even when no one is paying me to do so? These are different questions, and they lead to different answers. The first question leads toward the center of existing markets where competition is highest. The second question leads toward the edges, where fewer people are working precisely because the work seems less obviously valuable. But the edges are also where genuine novelty lives, and genuine novelty is what escapes commoditization. Specific knowledge is deeply personal in the sense that it cannot be cleanly transferred. It can be demonstrated. It can produce output that others can see and evaluate, but it cannot be fully articulated as a curriculum because much of it is tacit, embedded in judgment, intuition, and the ability to pattern match across a large number of experiences. This is actually what makes it economically valuable. Things that can be fully articulated can be fully taught, and things that can be fully taught will eventually be widely distributed, and things that are widely distributed will be competed into low compensation. Tacit knowledge, the kind that lives in the hands of the practitioner and cannot be fully written down, retains economic value for longer. The next structural element is accountability. This may seem like a less abstract concept than leverage or specific knowledge, but the framework gives it a particular meaning that extends beyond ordinary responsibility. Accountability here means being willing to put your name, your reputation, and your personal identity behind your work and your judgments. It means operating under your own name and your own voice, making claims and predictions that can be evaluated over time, and accepting the consequences of being wrong in public. This is uncomfortable. It is much safer to operate anonymously or as part of a large organization where individual contributions are diffused and individual failures are absorbed by collective structures. But this safety comes at a cost. Anonymous or diffuse work cannot build personal reputation, and personal reputation is one of the most powerful long-term assets an individual can accumulate. The value of reputation compounds in a manner similar to financial compounding, but through different mechanisms. When you consistently produce good work under your own name, over time, people develop calibrated expectations about the quality of what you produce. These expectations are valuable. They reduce the cost of selling your work, finding collaborators, attracting opportunities, and building the kind of trust that allows for high-value relationships. A person who has built a genuine reputation in a given domain, a track record of being right, being reliable, producing valuable output, does not need to market themselves aggressively for each new opportunity. Opportunities begin to find them because their reputation serves as a filter. People seeking someone with their specific capabilities know where to look. The flip side of accountability is that Genuine accountability requires accepting real risk of failure. If you never take positions, never make predictions, never stake your reputation on judgments that might be wrong, you cannot build a reputation for being right. The willingness to be wrong in public and to acknowledge it honestly when it happens is part of what makes a track record meaningful. A person who only ever takes visible positions when they are certain cannot develop calibrated credibility, because certainty in complex matters is rarely achievable. What builds credibility is a demonstrated ability to reason well under uncertainty, to be right more often than chance would predict, to update views gracefully when evidence demands it, and to be honest about the difference between what you know and what you are guessing. This is why accountability and intellectual honesty are deeply intertwined. The person who makes confident claims they cannot support, or who refuses to acknowledge error when evidence of error is clear, destroys their credibility over time rather than building it. The market for reputation is fairly efficient in the long run, in the sense that people who consistently overpromise and underdeliver eventually stop being trusted. The people who build durable reputations are those whose words and track records are consistently aligned. Accountability also interacts with leverage in an important way. The people who are trusted with the most leverage, the most capital, the largest teams, the most important projects are invariably those with strong track records of accountability. Capital flows toward demonstrated capability and demonstrated reliability. Investors do not give money to anonymous individuals without track records. Organizations do not delegate their most important work to people who cannot be identified and held responsible for outcomes. Accountability is the price of access to leverage, and leverage is the mechanism of wealth creation. The chain of logic connects directly. Building genuine, visible accountability over time is one of the most reliable paths to eventually accessing the leverage that multiplies your output. The time dimension of this process cannot be overemphasized. Reputation does not build in months. Specific knowledge does not develop in a year or two. The assets, code, media, businesses, financial positions that generate wealth without requiring daily labor take years to build. This is why the framework places such heavy emphasis on long-term thinking and on choosing your associates, partners, and collaborators with this time horizon in mind. There is a meaningful difference between playing short-term games and playing long-term games. And this difference shows up not just in strategy, but in the psychology and character of the people you are dealing with. In short-term games, the incentive is to extract as much value as possible from each individual interaction because the relationship is not expected to continue. In long-term games, the incentive is to create as much mutual value as possible in each interaction because both parties expect to continue interacting indefinitely and the ongoing relationship is itself valuable. This changes everything about how people behave toward each other. When you are engaged in long-term games with long-term people, trust accumulates. Trust reduces transaction costs. When you deeply trust a collaborator, when you have years of evidence about their reliability, their judgment, their honesty, you do not need elaborate contracts and verification mechanisms for every interaction. You can move quickly, take risks together, and divide responsibility in ways that maximize each person's contribution without requiring exhausting oversight. This is one of the reasons that deep, long-term professional relationships are among the most valuable things a person can cultivate. They are not merely pleasant. They are economically productive in ways that shallow, transactional relationships simply cannot be. The framework also makes a subtle but important point about the kinds of games that are worth playing at all. Zero-sum games where one party's gain is another's loss are not the games worth investing in for the long term, even when they can be won. Status games are often zero-sum. Political games within organizations are often zero-sum. Competitive displacement of incumbents in established markets can become zero-sum. These games absorb enormous amounts of energy and leave everyone worse off in aggregate, even when one party wins. The games worth investing in are positive sum, where value is created in aggregate, where the participants can both win, where the success of one player does not require the failure of another. Building something genuinely new, solving a genuine problem that was previously unsolved, creating tools or content or systems that expand what is possible. These are positive sum games, and they are the games the framework recommends playing. Now let us turn to the question of luck, because it deserves careful treatment. The framework does not deny the existence of luck. It would be intellectually dishonest to do so. The circumstances of birth, the country, the family, the historical moment are not chosen, and they matter enormously. Some people begin the wealth building journey with enormous advantages that others do not have. And acknowledging this is simply being accurate about the world. Luck, in the sense of unearned advantage or random fortune, is real. But the framework makes a distinction between different types of luck that is enormously useful. There is the luck of birth and circumstance, what you might call blind luck, which you have no control over and which operates entirely prior to any action you take. But there are other forms of luck that are not random at all. They are the predictable consequences of positioning, preparation, and reputation. Consider what happens when a person develops genuine expertise in a domain over many years, builds a reputation for producing valuable work, and cultivates a wide network of relationships with other competent people. When an opportunity emerges in that domain, a new technology, a market shift, a problem that needs solving, this person is uniquely positioned to recognize it and act on it. An outside observer watching them seize the opportunity might call it luck. They were in the right place at the right time. But this is a misattribution. The right place was not randomly assigned. It was the predictable result of years of consistent effort and positioning. The recognition of the opportunity was not accidental. It was the product of deep knowledge that allowed them to see what others missed. The ability to act on it was not a random gift. It was the consequence of the reputation and relationships they had built that gave them access to the necessary resources. This is what the framework means by engineering luck, not the manipulation of random processes, but the creation of conditions under which good things are more likely to happen. Luck, in this structured sense, is the intersection of preparation, reputation, and opportunity. You can control the first two. The third tends to arrive more frequently when the first two are in place, partly because people with good things to offer tend to bring them to those they trust and respect, and partly because a prepared mind with broad knowledge tends to recognize opportunities that others less prepared would not even see as opportunities. There is a further dimension to luck engineering that concerns the volume of attempts. A person who consistently puts their work into the world, who writes, builds, ships, pitches, creates encounters more potential opportunities than a person who waits for perfect conditions before acting. This is not a call for recklessness or poor quality. It is an observation that consistent, visible effort creates more surface area for the world to respond to. The artist who completes a painting a week and shows them to audiences will, over the course of years, have built both a body of work and a set of relationships that creates more possibilities than the artist who works on a single painting for years in isolation, waiting for it to be perfect. Volume of deliberate quality effort creates its own form of luck. This brings us to a concept that is simultaneously simple and difficult to fully internalize: the compounding effect. In financial contexts, compounding is the process by which returns on capital generate additional returns, producing exponential growth over time. The same principle applies to reputation, skill, relationships, and any asset that accumulates rather than depletes with use. But compounding requires time to produce its most dramatic effects, and this is precisely what makes it psychologically difficult to commit to. In the early years, the returns on compounding are modest. The investor who puts aside money in their 20s sees relatively small returns in the first decade. The writer who builds an audience sees relatively slow growth in the first few years. The engineer who spends years developing deep expertise in a specific field sees relatively modest differentiation in the early stages. It is only after a certain threshold, often described as the inflection point of an exponential curve, that the returns become dramatic and visible. The people who build great wealth through the mechanisms the framework describes almost invariably have this long time horizon as a fundamental feature of their psychology. They are not optimizing for the next quarter or the next year. They are making decisions whose payoffs are expected to arrive in 5, 10, or 20 years. This requires a particular quality of patience that is rarer than intelligence or discipline, the ability to maintain commitment to a strategy over long periods during which the visible returns are modest, and the temptation to abandon the strategy for more immediately rewarding alternatives is constant. This psychological reality is one reason the framework places such weight on choosing work that is intrinsically motivating work that you would pursue even without immediate financial reward. If the only reason you are doing something is the anticipated financial payoff, the long periods of modest return will erode your motivation. If the work itself is genuinely interesting to you, if it connects to your specific knowledge, your genuine curiosity, your actual values, then the motivation is at least partially self-sustaining. You continue not merely because of what the work might eventually produce, but because the work itself is worth doing. This makes the necessary long-term commitment far more sustainable. The question of internal transformation, the psychological shift that underlies the behavioral changes the framework recommends, is worth exploring directly, because it is easy to treat the framework as a set of strategic prescriptions without recognizing that its effective application requires a different way of relating to economic life than most people have been taught. Most people have been shaped to varying degrees by a scarcity mindset. This is not a character flaw or a failure of intelligence. It is a rational adaptation to genuine scarcity. For most of human history, and for many people in many parts of the world today, resources are genuinely limited, and competition for them is real and intense. In conditions of genuine scarcity, the rational strategy is to protect what you have, to be suspicious of sharing or collaboration, to see others' gains as potential threats to your own position. This is adaptive in the environments where it evolved. But the modern economy of knowledge work, digital leverage, and voluntary exchange is not primarily a scarce resource environment in the relevant sense. Ideas do not deplete when shared. Reputation grows with generosity rather than shrinking with it. Networks become more valuable as they include more people, not less valuable. Collaboration in the creation of genuinely new things produces surplus that could not have been created by any of the collaborators alone. In these environments, the scarcity mindset is not merely unhelpful, it actively prevents you from capturing the opportunities that are most available. The shift from scarcity thinking to abundance thinking is not a matter of positive psychology or optimism as an attitude. It is a matter of accurately understanding the economic environment you are actually operating in. When you understand that sharing your knowledge genuinely does not deprive you of it and usually generates returns through reputation and relationship, you share more freely. When you understand that helping a peer succeed does not reduce your own chance of success in a positive sum game, you help more readily. When you understand that the best opportunities tend to emerge from deep collaboration rather than competitive zero-sum striving, you invest differently in your relationships. These are changes in behavior that follow from a change in the mental model of how economic value is created and distributed. The abundance mindset also changes your relationship to risk. A person operating from scarcity thinking tends to be risk averse in ways that prevent wealth building. They avoid taking positions publicly because they fear being wrong. They avoid starting ventures because they fear failure. They avoid investing in relationships because they fear being taken advantage of. Each of these fears is individually understandable, but collectively they prevent the kinds of actions that build wealth. Wealth building requires accepting risk not recklessly, but deliberately and thoughtfully. It requires making investments of time, attention, and resources in things whose payoffs are uncertain. The person who never accepts uncertainty, never builds leverage, never builds a compelling track record, never develops the specific knowledge that comes from actually engaging with hard problems in real conditions. This is where accountability and risk-taking intersect in a psychologically demanding way. Accountability means putting your name on your judgments. Judgments made in conditions of uncertainty will sometimes be wrong. This means that accountability, pursued over a long career, involves the accumulation of visible failures as well as visible successes. This is genuinely uncomfortable. It requires a level of self-acceptance, an ability to distinguish between being wrong about a specific judgment and being fundamentally inadequate as a person that many people have not cultivated. The people who build the strongest reputations over time are not those who are never wrong. They are those who are wrong honestly, who acknowledge error clearly, and who learn from it in ways that inform future judgment. This is a kind of intellectual integrity that is psychologically demanding, but economically enormously valuable. Let us now think about the building of assets more concretely, because the concept of assets that work while you sleep can seem abstract if it is not grounded in the actual mechanisms by which such assets are built. The word asset in the relevant sense covers a range of quite different things. A business that serves customers without requiring the founder's daily involvement is an asset. Software that solves a problem for thousands of users without requiring the author's daily attention is an asset. A body of written work, essays, books, courses that continues to reach new readers and generate revenue long after the writing is complete is an asset. A financial portfolio that compounds over time is an asset. A reputation in a specific domain that attracts opportunities and relationships is an asset, though a less tangible one. What all of these have in common is that they required significant investment of effort, attention, and often capital to build. But once built, they produce ongoing value without requiring ongoing proportional effort. This front loading of effort is one of the reasons wealth building looks from the outside like it is impossible or based on luck. The person who eventually achieves financial independence through a combination of these assets usually had a period, often a long period, of investing heavily in building them with modest, visible returns. The people who knew them during this period may have thought they were wasting time pursuing foolish projects or failing to optimize for the best immediate income available to them. Then, at some point, the assets crossed a threshold and began producing returns that justified the entire prior investment many times over. From the outside, this transition can look like sudden luck. From the inside, it is the predictable consequence of years of deliberate patient building. The process of building such assets requires making choices that are frequently counterintuitive in the context of conventional career advice. Conventional career advice tends to emphasize optimizing for immediate income and status signals, prestigious employers, high salaries, impressive titles. These are not worthless. They can provide capital, credibility, and learning opportunities that are genuinely valuable. But they are not in themselves a path to the kind of wealth we have been discussing. A high-paying position with a prestigious employer is income, not wealth. It stops when you stop working. Building wealth through asset creation often requires accepting lower immediate income in exchange for positions that allow you to build specific knowledge, develop leverage, and eventually own meaningful stakes in the things you are building. The ownership question is central. Equity, actual ownership of a share of something valuable, is how most significant wealth is built. This is not primarily about the financial mechanics, though those matter. It is about the alignment of incentives that comes with ownership. When you own a meaningful stake in something, your interests are aligned with the long-term success of that thing. You are not merely executing tasks in exchange for compensation. You are building something whose increasing value accrues directly to you. This alignment changes how you work, what decisions you make, and how you think about the time horizon of your efforts. This does not mean that everyone must start a company or become an entrepreneur in the conventional sense. Ownership can be acquired in many ways. Early employees at startups who accept equity compensation in exchange for lower cash salaries are buying ownership with their labor. Investors, including small investors in public markets, are purchasing ownership of productive enterprises. Creators who build bodies of work and maintain ownership of that work are building ownership of media assets. The forms of ownership are diverse. What matters is the underlying reality that ownership of productive assets is how wealth compounds, while income is merely rented time. The intersection of specific knowledge, leverage, and accountability produces something that the framework describes as an individual's unique wealth building trajectory, the specific path through which a particular person with their particular combination of skills, interests, and experiences can create genuinely unique value in the market. This path is not transferable and cannot be fully prescribed in advance. It emerges from the accumulation of experience, the development of specific knowledge, the building of reputation, and the patient search for the intersection of genuine capability and genuine market need. This is why the framework, for all its structural clarity, ultimately resists being reduced to a formula. The structural elements are clear. Develop specific knowledge, build leverage through code or media or capital or labor, maintain accountability, think and act with a long time horizon, and invest in positive sum relationships with people who share that time horizon. But the specific application of these principles to any individual's life requires a process of self-examination, honest assessment of genuine strengths, and patient exploration that is inherently personal. No two wealth-building trajectories look exactly alike, precisely because specific knowledge and genuine capability are, by definition, not generic. What the framework provides is not a recipe, but a set of principles, structural truths about how value is created in modern economies that, when internalized, help a person make better decisions across a wide range of circumstances. The decisions are still yours to make, and making them well requires the kind of self-knowledge and honest assessment of your own capabilities that is among the harder cognitive and psychological tasks a person can undertake. The question of self-knowledge in this context is worth addressing directly. Most people have a poor understanding of their own specific knowledge, not because they are unaware of their credentials or formal expertise, but because specific knowledge, as we have discussed, is often tacit, often assembled from seemingly disparate experiences, and often undervalued precisely because it feels natural and effortless to the person who has it. What you find easy, others may find extraordinarily difficult. What you find interesting and obvious, others may find impenetrable. The things that feel natural to you because of your particular background and experience are often the things that are most genuinely distinctive about your potential contribution. This creates a somewhat paradoxical dynamic. The things that are most economically valuable about you may be the things you are most likely to undervalue, precisely because their ease and familiarity make them invisible to you as distinctive capabilities. The process of identifying your specific knowledge often requires external feedback conversations with people who can observe what you do and tell you honestly what they find remarkable or unusually good about it. It requires honest reflection on what you have consistently found compelling, even without external encouragement. And it requires the willingness to take seriously the idea that the accumulation of your particular experiences has produced something genuinely distinctive, even when the market has not yet recognized its value. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, it is worth stepping back and looking at the whole picture the framework assembles. At its center is a conviction that wealth in the sense of financial independence through asset ownership is not primarily a matter of luck, circumstance, or access to privileged networks, though all of these can certainly help. It is primarily a matter of positioning yourself over time at the intersection of genuine capability, genuine market need, and the leverage mechanisms that allow your output to scale beyond the limits of your personal time and attention. The engineering of this positioning is not a quick process. It is not a process that responds well to urgency or impatience. It is a process that rewards consistent, patient effort in the right directions, the development of specific knowledge that is genuinely yours, the building of reputation through accountable public work, the cultivation of long-term relationships with people playing positive-sum games, and the gradual acquisition of leverage mechanisms that allow your specific capabilities to produce value at scale. This is fundamentally different from how most people think about economic advancement. Most people think about career progression as a series of visible steps, promotions, salary increases, title changes that accumulate to a comfortable and respectable life. This is not an ignoble aspiration. A comfortable and respectable life is worth having. But it is a different aspiration from financial independence through asset ownership, and the strategies appropriate to the first aspiration are not particularly well suited to achieving the second. The person who achieves genuine financial independence through wealth creation, not merely high income, but actual assets that produce income without requiring their daily labor, has typically undergone an internal transformation as significant as any external strategic shift. They have moved from thinking of themselves primarily as an employee, a service provider, or a skilled practitioner, to thinking of themselves as a builder of systems, a creator of assets, and a participant in markets rather than merely a servant of them. This is not a transformation of ego or pretension. It is a transformation of how you relate to your own economic activity and what you understand to be possible within it. The patience this requires is a genuine virtue in the classical sense, not merely the absence of impulsivity, but a positive capacity to maintain direction and commitment over long periods of time in the face of uncertainty and the constant presence of more immediately rewarding alternatives. Patience, in the context of wealth building, is not passive waiting. It is the active maintenance of effort and direction, even when the visible returns are modest. It is the refusal to abandon a long-term position simply because short-term conditions are unfavorable. It is the ability to distinguish between a strategy that is wrong and a strategy that is right, but has not yet produced visible results, which requires both intellectual clarity about why the strategy makes sense and the psychological stability to maintain commitment through the inevitable periods of doubt. The framework we have been exploring is ultimately a framework for taking the long view economically, intellectually, and psychologically. It is a framework that takes seriously the difference between the appearance of wealth and its substance, between the performance of success and its structural reality, between luck as randomness and luck as the predictable consequence of excellent positioning. It is a framework that is deeply respectful of the complexity of the challenge and deeply resistant to the simplifications that make bad advice easy to consume but difficult to apply. What it offers is not comfort or certainty. It offers clarity, clarity about the mechanisms through which genuine wealth is created, clarity about the structural elements that position a person to access those mechanisms, and clarity about the internal transformations that make the necessary commitments sustainable over the time periods required. This clarity is valuable precisely because the alternative, the luck narrative, the fantasy of sudden transformation, the hope that the right opportunity will simply arrive, is so much more psychologically comfortable in the short term and so much more practically useless over the long term. The ultimate insight embedded in this framework, the one that unifies all of its structural elements, is this: the path to genuine financial independence runs through genuine value creation. Not the performance of value creation, not the extraction of value from others, but the patient building of things, systems, knowledge, and reputation that make other people's lives genuinely better in ways they're willing to voluntarily pay for. This is both a strategic observation and a moral one. The most durable wealth is built by people who have genuinely solved real problems, created real tools, or produced real understanding, not as a side effect of their wealth ambition, but as the substance of their work. When you build from this foundation, when the work itself is oriented toward genuine contribution and the wealth is the consequence rather than the primary aim, the motivation is self-sustaining in a way that purely financial motivation is not. The specific knowledge deepens because you are genuinely interested in the problem. The reputation grows because the work is genuinely good. The relationships strengthen because you are genuinely invested in the success of the people you work with. The leverage accumulates because the underlying thing being leveraged is actually valuable. All of these elements reinforce each other in a virtuous cycle that over sufficient time produces outcomes that observers who were not watching the process will call extraordinary. But none of it requires magic. None of it requires extraordinary luck in the sense of random fortune. It requires clarity about what wealth actually is, honesty about the mechanisms through which it is built, the courage to develop and deploy genuine capability in public under your own name, the patience to play long games with people who share that time horizon, and the wisdom to distinguish between the seductive urgency of short-term reward and the quieter, more powerful pull of compounding long-term investment. That is the framework. Not a formula, but a set of principles clear enough to guide decisions, flexible enough to accommodate the irreducible individuality of any particular person's path, and honest enough to deserve the serious attention of anyone willing to think rigorously about what economic independence actually requires.